Hello, my name's Andrew Brooks. Welcome to my YouTube channel. And in this episode, I'm going to be having a press to play chat with my old friend John Heaton and my new friend James Griffiths. So thank you very much for joining me on my YouTube channel. And as you can see today, I'm joined by my longtime friend John Heaton, all the way from Budapest in Hungary. And for the first time ever, I'm speaking to James. James, we've never met. You're a new friend to me. So tell me, where are you?
I'm in Lancaster, in the northwest of England.
Okay, excellent, excellent. And how do you,
Yeah.
I think you knew John, don't you, from before?
Just from YouTube, yeah. Just
Oh,
a purely virtual acquaintance so far, but hopefully that will change one day. Yeah, I started watching John's channel maybe 4 years ago, something like that. So yeah,
excellent.
It's been a long 4 years.
Yeah. and obviously John and I go back to the 80s, John.
The MPL Scruffs days.
MPL Scruffs days, yeah. Lots of times there. So anyway, after I did my little YouTube video for what could possibly be in the press to play archive set, if there ever is going to be an archive set, James got in touch and he said, why don't we just have a general chit chat about press to play? I think James is of my opinion that it's a great album. We'll find out later probably what John's opinion of it is as the chit chat goes along. I'd just like to say thank you very much to the person who messaged me and said it was great hearing John and myself talk. It felt like he was down the pub having a beer with a couple of Beatle buddies. So anyway, cheers. I've got my beer, so hopefully if you're watching this time, you can feel like you're in a pub and joining us with our general chit chat. Cheers, James.
I've not cracked mine open yet, but
okay.
It'll come.
So, okay. I'll start. Shall I? Basically, press to play 86. I think you and I, John, were knocking around in about 86, weren't we? Or was that just a little bit before?
Just before we met, I think.
Yeah. So I can remember seeing some lyrics to Press, the single Press, before it came out. Probably about 3 months before it came out, we were able to somehow nefariously get hold of some lyrics. And that was my first introduction to press to play. What was yours, James? Can you remember anything before the album coming out? Or
yeah, well, this is what makes it a significant release for me. I mean, I was 15 in 1986, and I've been a Paul McCartney fan since about 1978. And it was the first McCartney album that I remember where I knew it was coming out. It sounds a bit strange, but because I was quite young. So we're talking, Back to the Egg, Tug of War, Pipes of Peace. I was too young to be reading the music papers. I wasn't really aware of what was going on. So when a new album came out, it would just be, oh look, there's a new album out. I'd have no idea that it was coming. It would just be in the shop one day. And Press to Play was different because it was the first time I'd ever seen McCartney do a proper pre-publicity kind of launch. And so it was the TV interview that he did with what's his name, the DJ that he did the TV special with.
What, Mike Reed or
no Skinner, Richard Skinner.
Oh, Richard Skinner, right, sorry.
Yes, there was a documentary. Now my memory is telling me that this documentary came out before the release of the album, but I could be mistaken about that. I mean, you'll tell me, John, do you think that's true?
Round about the same time, I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, so it came on TV, and I got this distinct memory of going, "Oh wow, there's a new Paul McCartney album coming out," and it was the first time I'd ever kind of known it was going to happen. And I'd watched this documentary, so I kind of was primed for it. And I got the album for Christmas in 1986.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
When was it released? I can't remember what month it came out. It must have been, what, September-ish? Or was
I think it was the autumn.
Yeah,
I think it was the autumn.
Yeah.
As
I say, I can remember seeing the lyrics to Press in the summer. there was a lot of activity around MPL during that summer, and obviously it must have been all the lead up to the preparation for the album. I can remember McCartney going missing for a day. They didn't know where he was, and he'd gone on a practice run for the filming of the video for press. He just went on the tube, and I can remember John Hamill looking a bit flustered out the front of MPL, and and he sort of told us, he's gone walkabout, and they found him at Cavendish Avenue in the end. He just got on the train and on the tube, and it was just great just seeing him on the tube. I was listening to it today on the way home from work, the album, and press came on, and there I was sitting on the tube, and it took all my effort not to suddenly start at least mouthing the words or singing along. So, John, what about yourself? When was the first time you had any?
It's a great video.
Oh, it's brilliant. When was the first time, John, you had any?
I just remember not much before it came out. I bought it the day it came out. I got back to Wimbledon. I remember doing a track by track rating with my mate Phil Cheddar, because I seem to remember Graceland came out the same time.
Oh,
so I think
album. Yeah.
we listened to both albums back to back and gave a track mark out of 10. I don't have those anymore. But,
would you have marked Graceland above it at the time?
I think on the whole, yeah. I mean, nowadays it's an album I don't go back to that often, but at the time of release, it was pretty sensational. Yeah.
Yeah, I really loved the album when it came out, and I still do. And I probably don't play it as much as maybe I should, if it's one of my favorite albums. But when I do play it, I really enjoy it, and I don't skip any tracks, not even the one I don't like.
Oh well, you can call me Al. I don't like that track at all.
Oh, you're talking about Paul Simon. Yeah.
Oh.
Well, I was just about to complicate matters more and say that the album that I associate Press to Play with, and these dates are going to be strange now, probably, is Momentary Lapse of Reason by Pink Floyd. And my memory is telling me that I got both records at the same time, but when did that come out?
87.
Yeah, so there's something wrong with my memory somewhere, but I bracket Press to Play and Momentary Lapse together for some reason. It might just have been because I got to know them at about the same time,
Yeah.
It's strange the way you group these records together in your memory, these things that are not really connected, and yet they become these kind of parallel, associations. And the Floyd record, again, it was quite a problematic album, and Press to Play was a slightly problematic Paul McCartney album. So it was kind of interesting that there were two records which didn't necessarily show.
I'm ashamed to say I've never heard the Pink Floyd album, so I have to say Floyd aren't my favourite of bands. So there we are.
Well, don't you dare start with that one. And
no, don't start with that one. Don't start there. No.
I actually saw them at Nebworth when McCartney was on at Nebworth, and it was the worst. Yeah. It was the worst outdoor gig I'd ever been to. It was horrible weather. Yeah. The wind it was really high wind. I didn't enjoy McCartney's set at all because it was it just sounded awful. And then Floyd came on after him, and I thought this is a great time for me to get across to my car before everyone else. So I actually left before they'd finished. But anyway, back to Press to Play. Thinking about it, if you'd have said to me, there it is, all behind me. If you'd have said to me what opens it, I would have immediately said Press was the first track, but it's not. Obviously, there's tricks. My mind's playing tricks on me there, because when I did play it after a short absence, probably last year, I was like, this is in the wrong order. I was doing it on Spotify. I was doing it on Spotify, and I'm like, they've got this in the wrong order, boys. Yeah. So so obviously it's not Press is the first track. So
maybe you did the same thing as I did with AC/DC Back in Black. When you got it back from the shop, I put on side 2 thinking it was side 1 because it started with the title track, and Back in Black opened side 2. So for the first 10 years, I thought it was open side 1.
Yeah, well, it actually opens with Stranglehold. So, thoughts? Stranglehold, John?
Oh, I think it's a terrible choice as an opener. I think I remember quite enjoying it on the first listen and for a short time thereafter, but it's not doing much for me as a song, and I certainly don't go back to it. And the video is embarrassing.
You don't enjoy the video?
No, you know, Linda's being nice to the fan and all that, but it was a bit of a rip-off of that Status Quo video, Something About You Baby I Like, where the same thing, a fan goes and gets in backstage, and it was a bit of a copycat thing of that. I just don't particularly like that track. There are far better ones on the album for me.
Yeah.
James?
Yeah, I mean, Stranglehold is one of several McCartney-Stewart collaborations, and maybe we should just backtrack a little bit and just talk just briefly about this Eric Stewart collaboration, and
yeah.
I guess it will come up again and again as we go through these tracks. This idea that McCartney had teamed up with Eric Stewart, he'd been in 10cc. My 10cc history is not strong enough to know whether Eric Stewart was still in 10cc at the time, or whether he'd gone. I mean, they had such a tangled history.
Yeah,
but
well,
Paul,
I mean, he was in Broad Street, wasn't he, with him? So it goes back to '84 at the very earliest, or unless there was anything you can remember before that.
No, he's on Tug of War, isn't he?
You're right. Yes, Tug of War.
Yeah. So Eric Stewart had been around for a while. I mean, he and Paul had been friends back in the '60s, I think, because Eric had been in the Mindbenders, and McCartney had been a fan of 10cc. There's quite a famous story where McCartney sent a bunch of flowers to the venue where 10cc were playing on the night that I'm Not in Love hit #1 in the UK.
Right.
And McCartney sent them a big bouquet of flowers. So there was clear. I think he was friends with Graham Gouldman, but he was also particularly friends with Eric Stewart.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that when Wings falls apart in 1979, he goes into these very high-profile records, and he's working with all these people, Stevie Wonder and Michael Jackson. But sort of underneath all that, you've got this thing going on with Eric Stewart, who is not a household name exactly. I mean, he'd had big hits, but he was not, he's one of those breed of sort of invisible rock stars, a bit like Pink Floyd. And it's interesting that out of all those collaborations on Tug of War and Pipes of Peace, he comes out of those projects and Broad Street. And it's Eric Stewart that he ends up with on Press to Play. I've never quite got my head around that. Where did this idea come from in '86? Where did McCartney suddenly think, what I need to actually now do an album with Eric Stewart? Why him? Why then?
I wonder, I did hear, and I'm not sure if it's for this album, but I did hear that it was Richard Ogden, who was Paul's manager, tried to get him to work with different people, but I don't know if it was for this album with Eric Stewart. Because looking at the tracks, there's 10 tracks on this album, and 6 of them are co-written with Eric Stewart, which is that's a lot. That's a high percentage for a McCartney solo album, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he clearly must have thought. I mean, if you consider that, after this album, it was Elvis Costello, who was a much, much bigger collaborator. So you can kind of see why he would have gone with Elvis. Although even then, Costello was past his prime at that point. In the late '80s, he was no longer a spring chicken, and he wasn't really having big hits anymore. But he was a songwriter who had a big profile, whereas Eric Stewart did not really.
No.
So there's been various theories over the years about why he chose Eric as a collaborator, and one of those theories is that it's the slightly, it's this thing that people say about McCartney, how he doesn't really like to be challenged, and he doesn't really like to be told when he's wrong. And maybe Eric Stewart was kind of ideal, really, because he was a good songwriter, but he was not somebody. Well, he was of considerably lower status, shall we say, than Paul McCartney. He didn't really have the status of a Costello.
No.
So he wasn't somebody who was going to stand up to McCartney necessarily. He was definitely a kind of lower status figure, and that might have been why McCartney thought, I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it was wasn't it Flowers in the Dirt where there was the falling out, because Eric Stewart was meant to produce it, and it got him in to produced a few of them, and then I forget who he actually got into. Was it Hugh Padgham in the end to produce it?
So this is Press to Play we're talking about now.
Yeah, but Flowers in the Dirt later on, and then he basically kicks him out. So he gets rid of Eric Stewart. So
yeah, I mean the falling out actually happened during Press to Play. So
right.
Eric Stewart was never going to be, as far as I know, Eric Stewart was never going to be there for Flowers in the Dirt. I mean, I could be mistaken, but
okay.
there was a very specific falling out that happened, and we can get into the history of that as we go if you like.
Yeah. I'd be interested to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, John, do you know anything about? I mean, you've got this Hugh Padgham, Eric Stewart, McCartney trio at the centre of Press to Play, and it didn't go well. That's my kind of understanding of the history of it. Are you aware of any of that stuff?
Well, I think Eric was under the impression he was going to produce the album, wasn't he? And then he got there into the studio, and they had this producer. Although I wouldn't complain. He gets to co-write 6 tracks, which is more than Denny Lane ever did. There's 5 on London Town with Denny, and he got 6. So
yeah,
he took affront to that. Apparently, got upset.
I was just going to say, I think I'm getting my albums mixed up. It was I was thinking it was Flowers in the Dirt, but it was actually this one that the falling out occurred. Yeah.
I mean, I'll just really briefly show this record. Okay. So this is Invisible Touch. Now this came out in 1986. I don't know whether it came out before or after Press to Play, but it was engineered by Hugh Padgham. And Hugh Padgham was a real, he was riding high at the point where McCartney chose to work with him. Interestingly, because Eric Stewart was kind of like, he was a man who'd, his day had been and gone, shall we say, 10cc. Whereas Hugh Padgham was a real emerging talent. I mean, it was a massive album, Invisible Touch. Like it or not, it was a very commercial album. And it's interesting that Eric Stewart went into this record thinking he was going to be the producer, but then McCartney just unveils this absolute sort of wonder kid 80s producer with this incredible track record already, and you can really imagine Eric's nose being put out of joint by that. Like, oh my God, I thought I'm Paul's mate, back into the mist of time, into the 60s, and now we've got this kid, this 23-year-old kid in the studio who's this wonder producer, and he's going to be the producer. You can imagine what kind of conflict that might have led to.
Well, I was just looking. I've actually got a white label pressing of the album here, and this is included in it, and it actually gives you, see that there's sort of like there's the tracks, and it says on there September the 1st/8th. So that they're obviously either we're going to put two things out on different days. So we were right with the September.
Right. Okay.
So excellent. I have to say, during the time outside MPL and hanging around and all that, we was totally unaware of any problems with Eric Stewart and this new kid, as you say, Hugh Padgham. And we saw Eric go in and out of MPL a few times, but to be fair, I wouldn't know what Hugh Padgham looked like, so he could well have gone in and out as well. But that was so that's quite an interesting point about the about 6 tracks, and then he doesn't actually get to produce the album. So there we go. Okay. Any other thoughts about Hugh Padgham before we move on? Say that again, John.
What was your view on Stranglehold?
I like it. I'm sorry, John. I like it, and I like the video.
All right.
I think.
Go on.
Go on.
I was
going to say.
After you.
I was just going to say that I like it as well. I mean, it's not top drawer McCartney, I don't think, but I think it does work as an album opener. I've always liked the way it comes in. It's got a kind of scratchy, skiffly kind of feel on the drums, and it kind of builds quite nicely.
It's a steady beat on that. He's really whacking that drum. And I remember seeing the video probably in the 80s or 90s on some sort of show in the middle of the night on Channel 4, probably Tube, or it might have been something like the Tube. And that was my only time of seeing it until 20 years later when it was out on a DVD. And I quite liked it. I probably, as I say, I only saw it the once, unless I recorded it, but I only remember seeing it the once. And then about a week ago, I think I found a beautiful remastered copy on YouTube, and I think that just adds so. Seeing it in the high definition and the excellent quality, I think just made it so much better than it already was.
Have you heard the original demos? Because I know that these demos are quite readily available, aren't they, from the press to play era?
I have got a CD somewhere behind the computer, and I won't go rummaging now. But yeah, there is one called Played to Press.
All right.
And it's got most of the tracks, different versions, different mixes. I mean, even the released album got a different mix of press. I think it came out one week, and then he withdrew it a second week and put out a different mix on it. So I'm not sure which one, who mixed which one, Hugh Padgham or I think is it Julian Mendelssohn did another mix of it somewhere along the line.
There was a cassette that I had which had remixes of Angry, Press, and Pretty Little Head. Who would have done those mixes? I don't recall now. They were all good mixes.
Yeah, I mean, Played to Press itself is. I'm sure if you dig around on YouTube, you can find it on there. And from memory, it's a long time again since I've played that CD. But from memory, they are noticeably different to the released ones, but they're still good. So there's no duff unless there was a demo on there, just a piano bashing for Only Love Remains or something like that. But which is my least favorite track.
Think if there's any album which needs an unplugged version or a stripped down version, it's this one. I think the production pretty disastrous on quite a few tracks, and I think, wasn't it John Hamill who told you, Andrew, that the original version of Press was so much better before it got murky and cluttered? Wasn't it him who told you that?
It might well have been me, or it might have been Craig or Tanya or one of the other people hanging around. It's a long time ago, John. That's 30 years.
Well, one of the things that Eric Stewart was unhappy about was that these songs that they wrote together, they wrote them. I mean, it was McCartney himself who said that he wrote with Eric in a very similar way to how he'd written with John in the studio. They sat facing each other with these acoustic guitars, and they wrote together. And I think in Eric's mind, these songs were going to be much more kind of acousticy, skiffily, stripped back a little bit. And when they got into the studio, clearly Hugh Padgham had different ideas. He was going to bring the Hugh Padgham sound to it. And McCartney was probably quite into that idea because Hugh Padgham was this wonder kid. And I think there was a process whereby Eric Stewart just gradually watched these songs that they'd written together just morphing into something completely different to what he'd expected. And McCartney's got a habit of doing that. I mean, he sort of upset Costello in a similar way on the next album, where he did these songs with Costello, and then he went off and turned them into these sort of big production epics. And Costello was like, "Oh no, what's he done?" I'm thinking of things like "Don't Be Careless, Love," where it was a particular kind of mood. And That Day Is Done as well. And McCartney has a tendency when he gets into the studio, or he did have a tendency in the 80s, to just pile on the production and to maybe bury the song a little bit.
Yeah.
And you could maybe argue that there are a few tracks here, like John says, which would now benefit from being stripped back a little bit.
I was actually thinking to myself, what does this album remind me of a little bit as I was listening to it? And it actually reminded me a lot of Back to the Egg, where he's obviously experimenting on different sounds, because obviously Back to the Egg was meant to be the punk album. And I don't know what he thought this kind of album, but a lot of the tracks, they actually do remind me. And I wonder if this could be like labeled as Back to the Egg 2, where he's just trying different sounds. And obviously, I think it comes across really well. As I say, there's only probably a couple of tracks on there that I personally don't like.
Well, that's the interesting thing about this record, is how do you actually interpret what he's doing? Because on one level you think, is this McCartney in his experimental phase? He's got his experimental head on, because there are two McCartneys essentially, aren't there? There's the sort of goofing off McCartney who makes the McCartney album and the McCartney 2 album, and maybe you could now say, you know, the McCartney 3 album. And then you've got the kind of corporate McCartney who makes the albums such as, you know, Speed of Sound and, you know, Tug of War. Which McCartney is this? Because it's either the kind of goofing off McCartney who's decided to try and be a bit left field, but actually do it on one of his big mainstream albums, or is it the mainstream McCartney who's trying to move with the times and getting it a little bit wrong? Is he trying to do a kind of mainstream rock album with Hugh Padgham and it doesn't quite work, or is he trying to make an experimental record? What do you think?
I think some of the best things about this album are the experimental side to it.
Definitely.
Production-wise, he was going for the 80s current trendy sound, and it suffered because of that. I was glad that, you know, following Broad Street, I was glad that, you know, he wasn't retreading Beatles stuff. He wasn't doing duets with anyone. So I was glad to have a bona fide solo album. But I think the Broad Street criticism knocked Paul for 6. Definitely. His confidence is lacking, and I think that showed in the songwriting, to be perfectly honest with you. And Andrew, I don't think it's in the same league as Back to the Egg. And ironically, in the Richard Skinner interview, Paul's saying Back to the Egg is crap, and everyone makes Duff albums, and the Stones made Duff albums, and Elvis made Duff albums. Well, he's just promoting an album which is a lot more Duff than Back to the Egg ever was. So
he doesn't actually call it Duff.
To that.
Yeah, he says.
I think I told him a lot.
Yeah, the quote he actually says. He says
outside MPL in I stopped flagging off.
Yeah.
Yeah, he said Back to the Egg was not one of Wings's better albums. That was the actual quote. He never actually called it Duff. But the thing is, interestingly, in the Richard Skinner interview, he's already almost trying to make excuses for Press to Play. He says something like, it's your opportunity on an album to do something a bit more experimental and not try and hook things all the time, not try and have too many pop hooks. And when you think about it, that's a really strange thing for McCartney to say, because McCartney is Mr. Hook, isn't he? He's the guy that wants to be at number one. He wants to be commercial. And it's interesting that very, very soon after the release of the record, or maybe even before the record came out, he was already saying to a mainstream British journalist, yeah, this record doesn't have too many hooks on it. It was as if he probably knew already, yeah, this album's not really shaped up quite the way I wanted it to.
It makes you wonder that after the Broad Street, you know, where he was panned quite heavily, he's then doing this album and he's like, well, I'll tell you what, here's the baby. Hugh, you do what you think is probably best. And he did think this was the best way to go. Hugh Padgham probably thought this was the best way to go. I can see McCartney going along with it, really, just because he's been knocked. And
yeah, but unfortunately, the same thing happened that usually happens with McCartney in the studio, in that he finds it difficult to cede control to anybody. So when Hugh Padgham tried to actually exert some level of control in the studio, it actually led to rows between McCartney and Hugh Padgham. So Eric Stewart's already pissed off, and then McCartney and Hugh Padgham have this famous row in the studio, which culminates in McCartney saying to Hugh Padgham, how many number one records have you written, Hugh? Now, I don't know what the nature of the argument was that led to him saying this, but there'd been some disagreement going on as to how, I think it was a vocal take or something. And he sort of ends up saying this to Hugh Padgham. Apparently, Eric Stewart was in the studio at the time, and he just had his head in his hands at this point. He was like, oh my God, this is a complete disaster, because Hugh Padgham's this guy that's meant to be kind of in control. And clearly McCartney did not really want Hugh Padgham. He wanted him to be in control, as in to make a fantastic album for him. But as usual, he wasn't actually willing to listen to him or to do what Hugh Padgham thought he should do.
Yeah. The experimental side of it is very clear. And when you see some of the people that he's brought in. I read somewhere that he got like a 5-piece vocal group in, just to do the weird vocal noises, you know, and stuff like that, which is, yeah, it's great for experimentalism, really, I think. And that's one of the better things about this album, is how it has been, you know, used as a bit of an experiment. And okay, it didn't work in some people's views, but I think it provided some good stuff. And he had some friends join him as well, you know, other famous guitarists and the like.
Yeah, he had
Pete
Phil
Townsend.
Collins, Pete Townsend, Carlos Alomar.
Yeah.
Alomar.
Hmm.
Yeah.